you are part of this webinar because you are someone within your organization expressed an interest to learn more about Impact Plus. So our webinars this afternoon are our way to impart more of that information to you. To do that, we're going to first, I'll talk a little bit about the background to Impact Plus and how did this really game-changing set of suite of tools for our corrosion industry come to be. I'll talk about what those tools are. I'll talk about the value to the corrosion industry, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about how do you participate and how do you get access to the tools and use the tools. So in October of 2014, the NACE Institute launched the Impact Study. This was a study that updated a global cost of corrosion, but it was different from any other kind of cost of corrosion studies that had been done, in that this study assessed corrosion management practices. Along with assessing corrosion management practices and updating the global cost of corrosion, the study provides corrosion management templates. It provides financial tools for measuring ROI of corrosion projects, and it also provides a way for organizations to benchmark their corrosion management practices against the corrosion industry as a whole or against other organizations that are within their industry sector. As I mentioned, this study was different to any other cost of corrosion study that had been done, in that it was a global study. It covered, as you see on the map on the right-hand side of your screen, all the various parts of the world that participated in the study. And up on the left-hand side in the upper left corner, there were four large segments that were surveyed and included information in the study: the utilities, energy, transportation, and infrastructure. Now, NACE, while NACE International and under the auspices of the NACE Institute did conduct the study, we didn't do that in a vacuum and do it by ourselves. What you see on the screen are the logos of organizations and companies that collaborated around the world to help us gather the information. So what was the findings of the study? The finding of the study was that the global cost of corrosion is estimated to be in US dollars $2.5 trillion, which is equivalent to 3.4% of the global domestic product of the world. The impact study estimate was established utilizing publicly available studies from around the world. And what we found that was, regardless of what country a study was done in, whether it was China or UK, Australia and Japan, and all those country studies were included when we looked at their cost of corrosion. All of those countries had a cost of corrosion for their particular country that ranged somewhere between 3 and 5%. So when you took all of those studies and you did an estimate, we found that the global cost of corrosion was about 3.4%. Considering the world population is about 7.3 billion people, that dollar amount of 2.5 trillion means that for every man, woman, and child in the whole world, we spend about $342 a year for trying to mitigate corrosion. Now, when you think, well, $342 in some parts of the world, for those of us in North America, that probably doesn't sound like a lot. That would probably not cover the Starbucks budget for you for a year. But remember that in some of the developing parts of the world, $342 can be a significant part of their annual income. So it is a sizable number. What's even more important, you see there that up to 35% of that cost could be saved if corrosion management practices were employed. And that doesn't even mean all the new things that are being developed in our corrosion world, but just if those things that were currently available, 35% could be saved, and that equates to somewhere between $375 and $875 billion. The most critical finding of the impact study is that while it is important to continue investment in technology and systems for corrosion control, putting that technology into an organizational management system context and justifying corrosion control actions by business impact is essential. That was the #1 finding of the study. This can be accomplished by employing a corrosion management system that is understood and supported in every level of an organization. So as corrosion professionals, and as Kathy said when she made the introduction for me, I've been in the corrosion industry over 30 years, and it came as a real shock to me that I couldn't, an aha moment for me from the study finding was that it's not up to corrosion professionals to teach our senior leadership in our companies to speak corrosion or to understand corrosion, but rather for us to understand what are the drivers that drive our organizations and that keeps our senior leadership up at night. And those things are financial drivers, things like ROI. And so we need to learn the language of economics rather than expecting our senior leaders to learn the language of corrosion. So in response to the need to speak to business leaders in their language, NACE International developed Impact Plus. It just seemed a natural thing to collaborate with the American Productivity Quality Center, or APQC, in the development of Impact Plus, since APQC had been one of the contractors for the development of the impact study. The other contractor that worked with APQC was DNVGL out of Columbus, Ohio. Coupled with the fact that APQC has developed a software system that is called Mosaic, and that's the software system upon which Impact Plus is built. Now, Impact Plus is a suite of tools, and the first tool that we're going to talk about, and you're seeing it here, and it's very small, and I'm going to be talking about that in detail. So, on the next several slides, we'll drill down to the corrosion management maturity model. But you see that up there in the left-hand top corner of the screen. That's the first tool. The corrosion management maturity model is a structured model of corrosion management maturity characteristics with an assessment tool that enables evaluation of organizations. The second tool is the corrosion management process classification framework. This is a comprehensive listing of enterprise business processes that are augmented with corrosion-specific details. So think about a job classification that you might do through an ISO process, or other tasks that other jobs, processes within your organization that you break down to its very finest level. That's what a process classification framework is, except this one shows where corrosion, there are corrosion-specific elements to each one of those processes. The third part of the product suite is a reference library. There are thousands of content artifacts, reports, articles, case studies from NACE and APQC that are available to access through the corrosion management process classification framework. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. All of these tools are accessed and housed in a cloud-based environment known as the Impact Plus portal. And there at the bottom, you see when you do a corrosion management maturity model assessment, you use that maturity model to do the assessment. You get back an assessment report after it's processed by APQC. And then it's also compared, when you do an assessment, it's compared to anybody else that's ever taken the assessment. So right now there's some 30 organizations that have participated. So if you did an assessment, you would be comparing yourself to all the other 30 companies that have already participated. So looking at a corrosion management maturity model in a little more detail, we'll look first at the purpose of a corrosion management maturity model is to provide a structured model of corrosion management maturity characteristics. It has the features of 10 management system domains, 5 maturity levels, and characteristics or capabilities that you would expect to see at each stage of maturity. So exactly what does that mean? So looking at that in more detail, that drawing that you saw just a few slides ago, across the top are the 10 domains. And domains are logical groupings of functional components of a corrosion management transformation implementation. It establishes the domain boundaries and provides an overview of the maturity progression. So across the top, you see the 10 areas. Along the left-hand side, you see the maturity levels. A maturity level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, through the assessments that we've done over the past few months to get data that you can compare yourself to, there are very few organizations that are reaching a level 5 of maturity, and we'll talk a bit about that, a little bit more about that in a minute. And then within each one of those maturity levels, there are capabilities that you would expect to see at each stage of the corrosion management journey in each one of those business process areas. So let's look at those management system domains. These are the ones that you were seeing across the top of the model. In the impact study, the original impact study that was launched in 2014, we had 9 of these domains. And you can see here that we now have 10. The additional domain that was added in the impact as part of Impact Plus is culture and knowledge management. What we found in the original study was that this area was a huge gap for most of the survey participants. An example that I like to use is that as corrosion professionals, you probably experienced this maybe in your own organization or certainly with organizations in your client organizations. They have very robust corrosion management plans, and they're very well detailed, and they're very defined and refined, and they're kept in a very nice notebook or kept on some website somewhere or on a dashboard, but there's not a lot of implementation that happens with those plans. So that's part of the culture and knowledge management. How do you ensure that the plans and processes that have been developed are implemented? And another part of culture and knowledge management that we hear a lot about is the knowledge, the graying of our industry, of the corrosion industry. And as we're moving, many of us, towards the latter part of our careers, how do we capture the knowledge of the senior people in our corrosion groups? And we found huge gaps that a lot of organizations don't have anything in place for that. So for capturing that knowledge, so that we added that to our assessment just to ensure that as people are assessing their corrosion management policies and practices, they're understanding that that's an area that needs to be addressed. So what are those maturity levels that are over the left-hand side of the model? You'll see here that at level 1, it's an organization that is in a reactive mode. That means that you don't have a very robust corrosion group. You might have one individual that is responsible for it, but he may be part of the maintenance group. And you'll see that it's generally an individual thing, and it's very reactive. As you move up the maturity level, you'll see that it goes from individual to locally consistent. Locally there meaning that local means a particular geographic area or a particular operating unit, so it's a local thing. At a level 3, you move to enterprise-wide, which means that if an organization has 10 different operating units around the world or within the US or within Canada, everybody is doing corrosion management in exactly the same way. And if you move people around from one place to the other, they would have no problem getting right in and understanding the processes and procedures because everybody's doing it the same way. So as you see, as you move up the maturity level, it gets more and more sophisticated in your policies and practices. So those key characteristics and capability statements, remember, these are the characteristics at each maturity level. So while it's possible that an organization may exhibit capabilities associated with several maturity levels within a domain, a particular domain, like policy or organization, the model requires that for a given level of maturity to be achieved, the capabilities for that level and all lower levels in that domain must be sufficiently implemented. And for sufficiently, in terms of the model, it's 70%. 70% of all of the characteristics at that maturity level have to be accomplished before it would be assessed that you are the next level of maturity. And each of the capability statements across all of the 10 domains and the 5 maturity levels, there are 225 capability statements that would be assessed to those to 5 maturity levels. Each of those capability statements is equated to a question on the assessment. So the assessment is 225 questions, just like we have 225 capability statements. Let's look at one of these domain areas as an example. So let's use organization. In the organization domain, it evaluates whether corrosion management is centralized or distributed throughout the organization. That's what's covered in the organization domain. It evaluates interaction and reporting structures for corrosion and design engineers, vendors, and suppliers within the organization. So there are capabilities associated with each one of those groups, with corrosion management, with design engineers, vendors, and suppliers. So continuing on with that example, the key characteristics that are found under organization would be things like corrosion management roles and responsibilities are linked to define organizational structure. So that means that within the organizational structure of the company, there are very clear and defined corrosion management roles and responsibilities. And moving all the way up to a level 5, corrosion activities are aligned and embedded in other functional processes and work activities. Meaning, are they connected to the environmental plan? Are they connected to the safety plan? Are they embedded in other functional processes and work activities? So looking at organizations still, at a level 1 maturity, a company would have corrosion personnel that support asset lifecycle on a project-by-project basis. So for the entire lifecycle, meaning from the time it's designed until it's built, through the operation of it, and when it is taken out of service, whether it's mothballed or just taken out of service in some way, there is a corrosion engineering person that is involved on a project-by-project basis. Now, the key to this maturity, you'll see here at the bottom, the 3 capabilities all refer to project-by-project. So if a company is there, they're only doing corrosion management on a project-by-project basis, which would mean it's sort of ad hoc. There's nothing very formal or structured. Moving up to the level 2, you see the capability statements that a formal enterprise corrosion management group exists. That means that there's a corrosion management group for the whole company, so enterprise-wide. Or it could mean that interactions with corrosion engineering stakeholders are defined locally. That means, remember, I defined locally as a geography or an operating unit. So those would be capabilities at a level 2. That's still defined and compliant. But moving up to 3, it's managed and integrated throughout the organization. And level 4 and then level 5, innovative and leading. That means an organization that is at that level, if they are doing that capability at level 5, they are a benchmark and best-in-class organization. And as I've mentioned earlier, we haven't seen very many organizations that are operating at that level 5 maturity. So process classification framework. This is always, this is one of the tools that's a little bit difficult for us as corrosion professionals to get our arms around. We can kind of understand matrix tools like the corrosion management maturity model that we just discussed. So I like to liken a process classification framework to, most of us have had some exposure to ISO processes, and when you take any process and you break it down to sub-processes to its finest points, that becomes a process classification framework. It provides a common language for everyone to understand where their job fits into an overall process. So the principles of a process classification framework, you'll see here on your screen, but it breaks down a process into process groups, processes, activities, and tasks, all the way down to tasks. And you see there on the right-hand side, those are the operating processes and management and support services that are covered in a process classification framework that is included, that is part of the Impact Plus. Now, what makes this one different is that in each one of these operating process areas and management support service areas, we took a group of corrosion subject matter experts, and we identified in each one of these areas where would there be corrosion specific tasks that should happen. So if you're just looking at these very quickly, you could see that develop and manage human capital, for example. That would be all of the personnel things that happen. There are many things that should be considered there that could have corrosion management implications. The training of your corrosion management group, the recruitment, the succession plans, the career paths. There's all kinds of things that happen in any organization at that level, at that 7.0, that could have corrosion management implications. So when you go to look at the corrosion management process classification framework, somebody else has already done all the work to identify in all these areas of a company where there should be tasks that are associated with corrosion management. This just shows the primary uses for a process framework. In the realm of Impact Plus, what we use a process classification framework is to help us identify gaps in areas that aren't being addressed in terms of corrosion management. And I'll use the example that I just talked about a moment ago in the developing human capital. We found with many of the organizations that when we did the assessment, that there wasn't sufficient training that was happening. And so we went back to our process, the corrosion management process classification framework, and we identified where it is in that particular process in the organization that the training needs and training dollars, your budget, all the plans for training happen, and why is corrosion management or corrosion skills not being covered in that training. So we use it as a roadmap to help fill those gaps. The process classification framework is actually is actually owned by APQC. It is the intellectual property of APQC. And over the years, they have developed these individual process classification frameworks for many industries, and that's what the photos there. There are currently 18 of those, and it may be that if you want to go look at some of those, if like in the aerospace and defense, depending on what your industry is, there may be something that you would want to look at in these process classification framework. What you don't see here now is the additional one that is for corrosion. It was developed just for us, so you can find it on the Impact website, or you can also find it on the APQC website. The reference library has over 2,000 pieces of reference content that are linked to corrosion management, maturity model, business domains, and it's also linked through the corrosion management process classification framework. Following through with the example that I was giving about training in developing human capital, if you were looking at the corrosion management process classification framework and you were wanting to see was there material in the reference library that could help you with training, perhaps developing a training program, or just remember this is not technical information that's in this reference library. These are business processes. So it could there could be any number of pieces of business information in that reference library that could help you in closing that training gap. Not the specific technology of corrosion, but the process of how to develop training. About 1,800 pieces of this literature that is in the library is actually APQC literature, and that's because APQC is in the business of benchmarking. They are the world best known benchmark organization in the world for benchmarking organizations in all kinds of areas of business processes. So 1,800 pieces of that 2,000 is APQC literature that you would not have access to any other way unless you had access to this library. And the remaining 200 are NACE pieces of literature. So one of the things I failed to mention when we were first looking at the suite of tools for Impact Plus was that undergirding the whole process of how to utilize the maturity model, the process classification framework, it's very important. We have developed training for qualified navigators, because this is it's a very comprehensive program and somewhat difficult to understand and perhaps to move an organization through. Impact Plus is a very powerful tool, and it can seem very daunting. So for that reason, the program includes the opportunity to utilize qualified navigators to guide an organization through the assessment process. And to do that, we developed a 4-day training course that's very comprehensive, and it's taught by experts who built the system. And then at the end of the 4-day course, there is a certification exam to assess competency, and the attendees that pass that exam are then certified, qualified navigators. And here we have one of the qualified navigators, and he was one of the first ones to take our course, and this is what he had to say. So after hearing all that I've been talking about with Impact Plus, perhaps you're thinking, what's in it for me? or what's the value to corrosion professionals? What you're seeing on the screen here is not something that those of us at Mace Institute developed, but because we think it's the value. This is what asset owner companies are telling us that is the value to corrosion professionals. It's an integrated platform for corrosion management professionals who want to move their company to higher levels of performance. It gives us a common language and structure. It's an easy way for organizations to identify gaps in the processes that could lead to the reduced life cycle of assets. The corrosion management maturity model creates that roadmap of strategies. The reference library is there to manage knowledge and information collected through all components of the portal. And finally, what our users of Impact Plus are telling us that the confidentiality is respected, that all data is secured and held by APTC as an independent third party with expertise in data security. So I've talked about the corrosion management maturity model. We've talked about the corrosion management process classification framework, the reference library, and there across the bottom, underpinning all of those tools, are the Impact Plus navigators that would help an organization find their way to using these tools to ever increasing higher levels of corrosion management performance within their organizations. So how do I participate in this, in the utilization of Impact Plus? Well, you're probably here listening today because you did level 1. You went online and you looked at the maturity model and you looked at the process classification framework because it was free. And you said, you know, I want to know a little bit more about this. So level 2, and we actually had someone that attended our webinar yesterday that has done level 1, and after hearing the webinar yesterday, he went online today and he is going to do a self-assessment. He feels like that would be a first step for their organization, is to just do that self-assessment. And if you're interested in that, there's a way through the website for you to find out the cost of that. But he's going to do that self-assessment. And then after they have done a self-assessment, then they'll determine whether, at level 3, whether they want to go ahead and get a navigator that is trained in helping them move through the process, but more importantly, develop a plan for what to do with all of that information that came back and the gaps that were identified. And then at level 4, that's where you add the library. Now, I will mention that you can get access to the library by itself for an extra fee if you just want to have a subscription to the library. Let's look at that in another way. I want to go over this in several different ways to just be sure everybody understands how to participate. So at level 1, are you ready for an assessment? You use the free resources. Level 2, are you going to start with a self-assessment? That's a level 2. And I mentioned the individual from yesterday that said, yes, we're going to move on to level 2. So after level 2, are you ready for a professional in-depth assessment with a certified navigator? And then level 4 would add the resource library. If you just want to go right to level 4, you would have access to that library. So level 1 is for you if you want to assess whether your organization is ready to do either a self-assessment or a navigated assessment. Level 2 is for you if you want to undertake the corrosion management maturity model self-assessment to determine a baseline of corrosion management maturity for your organization. Level 3, if your organization is committed to development of a roadmap for improvement in corrosion management processes. And level 4 is if you want to do all those things in level 3, plus you want the resources to assist you in your journey to improvement. Now, there may be some of you that are online with us today that maybe are thinking about being that you would like to be a navigator. That is also an option for you, and there's a way at the end of our presentation that you can let us know that as well, and we'll get back to you with information about that. So, key takeaways from this webinar this afternoon. It's a product suite of tools to enable asset owners to measure and improve their corrosion management processes. There is something in an Impact Plus for every company, regardless of size. Impact Plus is a complex program customizable for all size companies. It is, according to the feedback that we've had from the asset owners that have participated in the pilot programs, this is a game changer for our corrosion industry. We had someone yesterday on the webinar that asked if this was similar to something else that was out there. I wasn't familiar with the program the gentleman asked about, but I can tell you that there is nothing else in our corrosion industry that is like Impact Plus. Our global NACE members and customers are asking for Impact Plus. Here is where you go online to let us know if you still want more information or to further look at the information I've presented today.